Hi, we're doing life sciences revision on nervous system, and you're going to continue. I know you're going to enjoy the lesson throughout until we get to the end. Have you ever thought about why you are able to hear sounds, you are able to taste, you are able to recognize people or recognize objects? If you are not able to tell how does it work, I'm going to show you how it works. The keywords that we're going to deal with here is central nervous system, which is formed by the brain and the spinal cord. Remember, I say it is formed by the brain and the spinal cord. Together, they form what we call central nervous system. And then we've got the word that we're going to use again, cerebrospinal fluid. We're referring to that fluid that are found around the spinal cord that we're talking to. And it also protects the spinal cord and the brain, which means the cerebrospinal fluid, it's a protective fluid. It's a protective layer around the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have another new word here, meninges. Again, this is now a membrane. The first one is a fluid. Then we are talking to a membrane. That also does what? It does protect the brain and the spinal cord. It is found around the brain and the spinal cord. Then we continue with the words again that we're going to come across while we continue with our lesson. Now we're looking at the gray matter. This is the part of the brain. We are still in the central nervous system. The part of the brain and the spinal cord that consists of the cell bodies. This is another new word that you'll come across, and the dendrites. We are still going to talk to dendrites and cell bodies when we talk to neurons. So don't worry about them. We'll talk to these. Then we have the white matter. That is again part of the brain and the spinal cord. It consists of the myelin sheath. Still, we're going to see this word when we deal with the neurons. And the axion, again, we will come across this word when we deal with the neurons. So if you look at this, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 terms that we're going to deal with when we deal with the nerves. Now, we said we're dealing with the central nervous system. If we're dealing with central nervous system, we said central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So let's look at this brain. Its part and the function of each and every part of this brain. We start here. Here we've got the cerebellum. This is what we're talking about, the biggest part of the brain. What is the function of this biggest part of the brain up to here? It controls voluntary, meaning those actions that you decide to do. This is where now you take a decision. This is the control by the cerebrum. Again, this cerebrum receives and interprets sensations. What are we talking about when we're talking about sensations? What you feel from the sense organs. Again, it's where the high thought is processed. So, if you look at the cerebrum, it's the biggest part of the brain, but the name is shorter. I'm telling you this now because I know you always confuse cerebellum and cerebrum. So, cerebrum, the biggest part, cerebellum, the smallest one. We get in there. Let's continue with the part of the brain. Then from there, we move to the second one, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, we're looking at this part of our brain. Then what does it do? It connects the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. It's a connecting part of the right and the left hemisphere. Then when it connects the two hemispheres, it's there to allow what? Communication between the two hemispheres. For you to remember the corpus callosum, if you put your fist together like this, you take this as the left-hand hemisphere of the brain, the right-hand hemisphere of the brain. Then when we do the section, the transverse section of the brain, this would be your corpus callosum. You'll remember this when you do your fist. We continue now with the parts of the brain and the functions. We move to number 3 here. Then we talk into the cerebellum. I said we've got cerebrum, the bigger part. Now we move into cerebellum, the smallest part of the brain that looks like a leaf. You will remember that. Please make sure you understand the cerebellum as the smallest one, shaped like a leaf, and cerebrum, the biggest part of the brain, where your high thoughts are. Then we continue. Then we are here, where I said you should remember that it looks almost like a leaf. That is the shorter name, the longer name for the smaller part of the brain. What does it do? It coordinates all voluntary. Remember, we said the cerebrum, the biggest part, does what? Controls. The smallest part, which is having a longer name, coordinates voluntary movements, and it controls muscle tension and maintain balance. For me to be able to be balanced, even if when I run and I change direction and I change speed, the cerebrum will be there, cerebellum will be there to maintain my balance. That's the function of the smaller part, that is leaf-like structure with the longer name. Then we continue with the parts of the brain again. Number 4, that is medulla oblongata. This is the part that we're talking to, which transmits the nerve impulse between the spinal cord and the brain. And it also controls involuntary actions. We did talk to voluntary actions. Now we're talking to involuntary actions, like your heartbeat, your breathing. You don't control that. It is controlled by your medulla oblongata. Number 5, that's your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is here in the brain, and it is the control center of hunger, thirst, sleep, body temperature, and emotions. Whatever you feel, when you feel hungry, you should know that is the hypothalamus that is in action. Then we move to the spinal cord. As we said, that central nervous system consists of the spinal cord and the brain. Now we're looking at the spinal cord. Here's the structure of the spinal cord. We've got the gray matter here, and the gray matter here, and the gray matter here. And we've got the dorsal root. This is the root that comes from the top. The D, remember the D comes before the V. So the top part of this part of the spinal cord is the dorsal, remember, with this D. And then we've got the ventral root. V comes after D. Then we've got the spinal nerve that moves in here. Then we talk into that. The center here, we're looking at the central canal. And this part that looks like age is what we call the gray matter. That is the structure of the spinal cord. Let's continue now. Keywords of the part that we dealt with. We've got the spinal cord. This spinal cord connects the brain and the rest of the nervous system. We move to the receptors now. The receptors receives the stimuli, and they are located in the sense organs. So the nerves convert the stimulus into an impulse. The effectors here, we're talking to muscles or glands that responds to the impulse from the central nervous system. Then the dorsal part of the dorsal part of the spinal cord, I said it is at the top. Remember, I said the D comes first before the V. So the dorsal root is the back part of the top part of an animal spinal cord. Ventral part is the front part of the abdominal or the lower side. The afferent conducts inward impulses, and the efferent conducts the outward impulses. Then functions of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a pathway for all the impulses, and it conducts them from the receptors to the brain, and from the brain to the effectors as muscles or glands. Then the spinal cord again processes all the reflex actions. This, we are coming to it. Then we've got the parasympathetic and parasympathetic nerve impulses and conducted along the spinal cord and to all the organs. Guys, we did look at the structure and function of the brain and the spinal cord and everything. For now, let's go grab a glass of water, then we move to the ad break and continue with our interesting lesson. Hi guys, we are back. We are refreshed. Let's continue now with the questions on what we did before we went to our break. Question 1 here, the first question here, we're looking at the diagram. It's key to study the diagram before you attempt any question. So the diagram here, we see the structure of the brain, and we've got all those letters that indicates the part of the brain. So the first question will say you have to identify A and C. So because we just dealt with, you will tell me now what is A. So if you got it right, your answer should be, the answer for A is the spinal cord. The answer for B, we look at B here, is the corpus callosum. Move to the next question. It says we're still writing down letters and name of the parts there. We've got number A, the part that has the center for interpreting taste. Then number B for that, the second question is write down the letter and the name. Remember, you'll get a mark for a letter and you'll get a mark for the name. The first 2A will be you give the letter and the name that has the center for interpreting taste. Number B, the part that regulates the heart rate. Number C, the part that is responsible for motor coordination. I believe you've got answers now. Let's check if your answers are correct. Yes. Number 1, we said A is spinal cord. C is corpus callosum. 2A, you were supposed to give the letter and the name. So it's D, cerebrum. B, medulla oblongata. E, cerebellum. If you look at the answers here, there are ticks for a letter and the name. Letter and the name. Be careful not to forget to write both if the question says letter and name. So we've got other keywords there, myelin sheath. We talked to that when we started. It's just layer that covers the keywords here. We've got neuron. That is a specialized nerve cell which transmits the impulse. The cell body, it controls the metabolism of the cells. Then the dendrites, we did see the dendrites at the beginning. They carry the impulses to the cells, cell body. And we've got the axon that we talked to when we started. We say this axon carries the impulse away from the cell body, the dendrites to the cell body, the axon away from the cell body. Keywords, we continue. Myelin sheath, I did talk to that. It's just a fatty layer that covers the axon and the dendrites of the neuron. And it acts as an insulation, and it speeds up the transmission of impulse. Remember the neuron, the function of the neuron is to transmit the impulse. Then we've got another new word there, the synapse. That point where impulse passes from a terminal branch to the axon of one neuron and to the dendrites of the next neuron. Neurotransmitters, they are the chemicals which carries impulse across the synapse. These are the key words. Then let's look at the types of neurons. I know for now you know the types of neurons. We'll just go through them and to remind you so that when you sit for your exams, you still remember. We've got the motor neuron, the interneuron, and the sensory neuron. If you look at these neurons, the motor neuron here, it takes the direction of the impulse here. And then the part that you need to know is the cell body, the nucleus, the dendrites, the axons, and the myelin sheath. You did see the function. Then the interneuron or the connector neuron. It's found between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron here, the word sensory, you will remember from the sense organs. So it takes the impulse to the spinal cord. Then the motor neuron here takes the impulse to the effectors. These are the three types of the neurons that you need to know. Then the functions. Here, I use different colors so that you should remember the functions. I already said the sensory neuron carries the impulse from the sense organ, sensory, and connector neuron or interneuron receives impulse from the sensory neuron, and it carries that impulse towards the motor neuron. And let's see what the motor neuron does. Motor neuron or effector neuron, because it takes the impulse to the effectors, the muscle or the glands. It carries impulse away from the central nervous system and carry the impulse to the effectors. Why to the effectors? For response. The synapse. That is the part, the space here between the neurons. It's that point, we did talk to it, where the impulse passes from the terminal branch of the axon to, these words are very important, to one neuron and to the dendrites of that neuron, of the next neuron. From this neuron to another neuron. How? The terminal branch of the axon of that neuron to the dendrites of the next neuron. Then we're talking about this gap, this opening here. This gap between the neurons, we refer to it as the synaptic gap. Then, because we did look at the neurons, the three types of neurons, the labelings and the functions, so let's take the questions now. I'm sure you'll be able to answer these questions. The first question here, it says various options are provided as possible answers to the questions. Then what you do, you only choose the answer. So if you answer a question like this instruction, it's a multiple choice question, what you do, you first delete or do away with those that are not correct. And the last one that looks almost correct, you read again and make sure it's the correct one before you choose it. Which one of the following shows the correct diagram, direction of the impulse transmission through a neuron? Keywords here. We're looking for only one of the following. That does what? That takes the direction of impulse and transmits it through the neuron. Then there are the questions. The options. We've got A, that is the direction. We're looking at the direction, remember, of what? Of the impulse. Through what? Through a neuron. So what would be the direction? The first one says it's from the axon to the dendrite and to the cell body. The B says from the dendrites, axon to the cell body. Number C says cell body to the axon to the dendrites. Number D says dendrites to the cell body and axon. So direction, which one will be correct in this case? Number D will be correct. Why number D? Because the impulse cannot start at the axon. Axon is it's that part that is covered by the myelin sheath. So here we see dendrites again. From the dendrites cannot be straight to the axon. This cannot be correct. Then we don't take it. Because from the dendrite, it should be to the cell body if you remember the structure of the neuron. Number C, from the cell body already you know it cannot be. So the most important, the most correct one is D, because it gives us the correct sequence of the direction of the impulse. We move to the next one. The following is the functional connection between two consecutive neurons. We've got number A, receptor. We've got B, synapse. We've got C, neurotransmitter. We've got D, nucleus. D already is out. It cannot be a D because we're looking at the functional connection between two consecutive neurons. We said we delete what is not in. Receptor cannot be receptor. A synapse. Synapse should be the correct one. Let's see. Good. B is the correct one. Then number 4 here, we're looking at the diagram there that shows different types of neurons. We did neurons. And then it says, give only the numbers. When you answer, you only give the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4 of 2 neurons. How many? 2 neurons. That does what? That transport impulses from receptor to the central nervous system. Then let's look. That would be number 1 and number 4. The 2 neurons are the ones that transport impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. The next question, still based on the diagram. You give the number 1, 2, 3 only. You don't write the words. Number B says the one that will have a faster transmission of impulse. Which one between the 4? They say the right one here, the answer is number 3 and number 1. The next one, still the same instruction. The one that are damaged if a person can feel the stimulus but unable. The key word there, unable. They can feel, but they are unable to do what? to react? Which one? You remember the functions? I believe you've got the right answer. Here's the right answers. That's number 2 and number 3. Guys, we need a break. Let's go for ad break, and while we are on the ad break, grab a glass of water, then we come back and continue. Guys, welcome back. Continuation still. After the neurons, let's see you. We continue now to the reflex action and the reflex arc that we did talk to when we started our lesson. The important words or the key words there, we've got the reflex arc. This is the pathway along which the impulse is transmitted to bring about response to the stimuli. Now, when I give you this definition, you are having a neuron in your mind, I believe. Then we've got the reflex action. There's a difference between the arc and the action. Reflex action takes place because the reflex arc is there. What is this reflex arc? The path of the pathway of the impulse. So, reflex action. It's a very quick, automatic response to the stimuli. Why quick, automatic? The reflex action should be quick or immediate to avoid severe injury. Why do I say that? If you step on a pin, you cannot think about it to say, oh, this pin, I feel pain. Immediately, you pull your foot away from that pin. That's the reflex action. The impulse went through the reflex arc. Let's see now. I gave examples there that when you sneeze, you don't think about sneezing. Because we said, again, it's automatic. You just sneeze. The removing of your body part, I gave an example when you step on a pin. There comes the reflex action and the reflex arc. Pathway of impulse and the action, meaning the response that is automatic and very quick to avoid severe injury. So if we look at this, you can see that. We've got the stimulus here, which is hot object. Then what is happening here? If you look at this diagram, you can see we've got the receptor that would be your finger that touches the hot part, and what is going to happen? The impulse will be carried by, remember what type of a neuron carries this impulse from the sensory organs? That will be your sensory neuron. And then the direction we set is to the spinal cord. Then it will move. Then what is going to happen when the sensory neuron transmits that impulse? Remember, it was a stimulus from the beginning because it's still in the atmosphere, in the environment. But once it gets into the sense organ, we've got it will be converted into an impulse that will be able to be carried by the neuron to the spinal cord. Then, what is going to happen there? The impulse will be transmitted to the interneuron. Remember the function of the interneuron? From the interneuron, it will now, the interpretation of the impulse will be carried by the motor neuron. Remember, motor neuron is carrying impulse from the spinal cord. And then this motor neuron will carry this impulse through this blue. It gets to the muscle here, which is referred to as an effector. So once the impulse gets to the effector, that would be your muscle. The muscle will contract. Why contract? It responds to the impulse. So once the muscle contracts, you know the function of the muscles, it's for movement. Once it contracts, then you'll move your hand away from the hot object. That is reflex action through the impulse moved through the reflex arc to give us a reflex action, a quick response. Now let's see if you understood the reflex action and the reflex arc by answering the following questions. Number 1, it says you give only the letter, only the letter. But the first thing that you do, don't forget you have to study the diagram for you to be able to answer the questions. So the first question there, the question said give only the letter of the part that does what? That represents sensory neuron. Then you go back to the diagram for you to get the correct answer. Before you can go to the correct answer, you must remember the function of the sensory neuron. Carries impulse to the spinal cord. So what would be the answer? Already I reminded you. So the answer will be B. Let's see if you are right. Yes, it is carried from here. It gets into the spinal cord. So the direction is to the spinal cord. Number B says you give the letter of that part that represents the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Remember I said D comes before the V. So it is at the top because D comes before V. So what will be your answer? You go back to the diagram and look at the diagram. Then you'll get the correct answer as what? As C. This is the top part of the spinal cord. Then we move to number C, that part that represents an effector. Remember, the motor neuron carries impulse to the effector. So we're looking at the diagram here. Where will be our effector? These are muscles, I believe. Then already I gave you direction to answer, to give answer. That will be A. Yes, A is the muscle, is the effector. Then we move to the second question. You write down letters only for the pathway that the impulse will take until a response occurs. The example, we did that. We must see the impulse from the sensory organ through the sensory neuron into the interneuron to the motor neuron and to the effector. That is the direction. Then let's see if our direction is correct. But they said you should give only letters. We said it's the neuron here, which is the sensory neuron, through the D here, which is the interneuron, to the G here, which takes the impulse to the effector. That would be your motor neuron. Then the next question, explain one consequence for the reflex action. If part D has been damaged, where's part D? We are talking about this part D, the interneuron. If it is damaged, explain. Remember the verb explain, you give the cause and effect. So let's look at the answer here. The sensory neuron will transmit the impulse. Remember, from the sense organs to the sensory neuron, the impulse will be transmitted. Good. Then you get a mark for that. Then after the transmission of impulse from the sensory, by the sensory neuron from the sense organ, what will happen? Then the sensation will not be felt. Why? Because this part is damaged. Then what will happen? The body would not be able to do what? To respond. So this is the cause. Its sense will not be felt, so the body will not respond. I gave the cause and effect for the word, for the verb explain. The next question, it's another diagram still, but if you look at the diagram still, it gives us the diagram of the the reflex action on the reflex arc. The diagram along the side shows the reflex action. You give only letter of the part that is responsible, that represents the effector. That would be E. Let's look at E if we all agree that this will be our muscle as the effector. And then the letter that represents an interneuron from here, do we see any letter that shows us the interneuron here? I believe we see it, and the answer here will be A. We are right to say A. Now we move to number C. The letter that represents sensory neuron. Remember, we've got a finger here as our sense organ, and then we need that neuron that represents sensory neuron. So it must be a neuron from the sense organ. Let's follow it until we can see which one. Good. The answer should be C. Let's see if you are right. Yes, it's C. Then we move to the next question. It says you give the letter and the name of the neuron in the same diagram that is probably damaged if a person is able to detect the stimulus but cannot respond. Then, number 3, it says, the answer there is F. That is the motor neuron. Because the question said you give the letter and name of a neuron in the same diagram that we have that is probably damaged if a person is able to detect but cannot respond. So probably it should be F here, which is which type of a neuron? A motor neuron, because the impulse was able to be transmitted. Number 3, you state the nerve impulse that travels from D to E, or from E to D. Then your diagram is key for you to look at the diagram before you answer the question. Then you're looking at D and E, or from E to D. Let's see the correct answer. The correct answer will be D to E, because it's from the sense organ and then to the interneuron impulse and back to the effector for response. So the correct answer is D to E. That is the correct sequence or the correct direction. Guys, we did the reflex action and the reflex arc. I think now we need to take a break so that you absorb exactly everything that we did. Now, let's go grab a glass of water. We'll come back. Thank you. The keywords for this part that we're going to deal with, we're looking at the peripheral nervous system, and we are looking at autonomic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system here, we're talking about all the nerves around or outside the central nervous system. Remember, it's the brain and the spinal cord. All the nerves that are from the brain and the spinal cord are referred to as the peripheral side nerves. And the autonomic nervous system, they are those, the word auto means you are not in control. So it says here it controls involuntary actions. Example of involuntary actions, heartbeat. When you eat, when you sleep, your heart continues to beat. And breathing, you don't control it. After eating, you don't tell your stomach to digest, but digestion takes place. And the secretion of the glands, we know now our glands, they just happen. So this secretion of the hormones by the glands falls under the autonomic nervous system. So, what is sympathetic branch? This sympathetic branch of the nerves is the one that prepares the body for what? For action in emergency situations. Emergency. Then what comes in is the sympathetic. Sympathetic, if you remember in English, when it's sympathy, then you will remember. If you've got sympathy, you feel for somebody. So, or for something, you've got that space. Now this part of the nervous system that is sympathetic, it takes care of us because it kicks in when there is an emergency. Then the parasympathetic branch is only active under ordinary restful conditions. When you are not in danger, you are just sitting, eating, then we are looking at the nerves that are active there as the parasympathetic branch or parasympathetic nerves. The diagram here shows you the peripheral nervous system. Remember we said we are talking about the nerves around the brain and the spinal cord. So this diagram just shows you the nerves that we are talking about when we are talking about the peripheral nervous system. Then autonomic, remember you break this word into two. Auto, you don't have control, involuntary. So autonomic nervous system is the autonomic system that has two branches, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Remember, the sympathetic emergency, it kicks in for the emergency. The sympathetic, when you are at rest, you are restful. There's nothing that makes you to be at the edge. So we have the parasympathetic branch that kicks in. Here now, I'm going to give you a table that gives you the difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Let's look what is the difference between the two. The sympathetic, remember, emergency, increases heartbeat. Why heartbeat need to increase? Because we need more energy. And parasympathetic, what does it do? It decreases. This one increases the heart rate, and then parasympathetic will decrease your heart rate. You are at rest. You don't need too much energy, and you don't need too much of the blood to be pumped to your muscles. Then sympathetic, what does it do? It relaxes the wall of the bladder. Then this one called the parasympathetic contracts the wall of the bladder. The sympathetic dilates the pupil. When you are surprised, you are in an emergency, then the pupil will dilate. It will become bigger. If you are at rest, there's nothing that is coming, there's nothing that shows danger to you, your pupil will constrict. They will become small. There's nothing that is showing you that you are in danger. Then sympathetic again. What will happen if we're looking at the sympathetic? It constricts many arteries, and this will dilate many arteries. And again, the sympathetic increases body pressure, while the parasympathetic will decrease. So if you look at the functioning of parasympathetic and sympathetic, they work antagonistically. If one increases, the other one will decrease. That's how they work together in our system to keep us going. Then we dealt with a central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, the neurons. But let's see if we've got the defects or some diseases that affect these the nervous system, and which diseases are we dealing with now? We've got Alzheimer's disease. So we look at this diagram that will give you the idea of the Alzheimer's disease. We look at this neuron, meaning it affects the neurons. If you look at this neuron, the axon here has been damaged. Then we refer to this as Alzheimer's disease. Remember, we've got the neurons. This is the brain. We've got the neurons in the brain. So we say Alzheimer's disease, progressed brain cell. It's a progressive brain cell death that occurs over a long period of time. Usually it affects people at this age, older people, at 65. And it is mostly another form of what we call dementia. Then what are the symptoms of this Alzheimer's disease? It's memory loss. You know, once you grow up, you start to forget. Hence, older people start to speak to themselves so that they should not forget what they wanted to do. So here we say an Alzheimer's disease, its symptom will be memory loss, but it should be severe memory loss and confusion. But do we have the cure for that? No. For now, we don't have the cure, but the disease is there. The next one that we are dealing with multiple sclerosis. Then let's look at the neurons again. It means it affects the neurons. But here now, we see the myelin sheath that has been damaged here. So this is a progressive degenerative disorder of the central nervous system. Remember, brain and the spinal cord. So here, it damages the myelin sheath. Like you see in the diagram, the myelin sheath is damaged. Remember, myelin sheath needs to cover the axon. But you look at these spaces, it means myelin sheath has been damaged. So the diagnosis it is diagnosed between the ages of 20 to 40. If you look at the multiple sclerosis, it's not only for aged people. It starts from the age of 20 to 40. And it mostly affects women more than men. Sad, eh? Then what are the symptoms? It's again loss of speech and vision. So it affects your eyes. And once it affects your speech, it means also the brain is not functioning well. And it also affects your vision. And it makes you not being able to walk because they say you experience difficulty in walking, which means your cerebellum also is affected. And then there's pain, there's fatigue, there's again memory loss. So this is the second disease that affects our nervous system. Do we have a cure? No, we don't have a cure so far. We're now looking at the summary of the lesson. We're looking at the central nervous system where we said it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Functions, we did the functions and the structure of the brain. And again, the spinal cord. And we talked to the synapse when we were talking about the reflex action on the reflex arc. We did talk to the reflex arc, reflex action. And I did show you the diagrams. And then we did talk to the diseases that affect the nervous system, which is the Alzheimer's disease and the multiple sclerosis. This brings us to the end of our lesson. Thank you very much, guys.